Hello. Today I'd like to talk about a topic that you never hear talked about in a therapist's office, but you might in a barber shop or beauty salon, when you might overhear someone talking about a neighbor. And the topic is, what does it mean to be naive? And what do we mean by the word naive? And how many people are there, in fact, who would fall into this category, and how severely? Well, first of all, I would define naive as an inability to see what the character is of another human being other than ourselves. And this seems to be very commonplace of a problem for kind-hearted people or gentle people, highly loving people who can scrutinize their own lives very strongly and very harshly and even judgmentally, and know their flaws quite well, or most of them. But when it comes to others, they tend to see most others as way above them. You could say they idealize them, or they're just blind. So, the term naive could apply to the failure to be able to spot certain types of people who you might call toxic or otherwise very discomforting to be around, and people you should probably keep your eye out on to be sure you don't come out on the wrong end of the stick when you rub shoulders with them. And of course, this has a lot to do with a person's morals and moral code, where scriptures in various faiths, various religious faiths, would say all the time that certain behaviors are immoral. And if we were to ignore such stances and behaviors in certain people, then I guess we could be called naive, couldn't we? Now, there have always been some self-help books on the market on how to avoid being manipulated, for instance. And there are plenty of scriptural-based religious books out on the topic of sin and evil. But a couple that come to my mind on this general overall topic of character are those written by Robert Greene, for instance, who wrote books like The 48 Laws of Power, and many others too. Or Dr. George Simon, having written 2 books like Wolves in Sheep's Clothing and Character Disturbance, whereby he talks of how life these days has a lot of people in societies, particularly certain ones, that are very deceptive and very aggressive. And he outlines a program to help identify who these people are and label the particular strategies they are using to manipulate people. And his contention is that before his clients come to see him, they tend to not be able to do this very well and get manipulated a lot and turn to frustration and anger. And he strives to provide them with the proper labels to identify these behaviors and why people even do this, certain people. And then, of course, there's the famous book that sold almost more books than any other book, Pulling Your Own Strings, which was perhaps Wayne Dyer's first book, Dr. Wayne Dyer. And he spends a great deal of time talking about deception and manipulation. But the point is that the naive person tends to be the sort who would say there's very little, if any, manipulation even going on in the first place. So why look for it, and then why bother to label it, and furthermore strive to counteract it? So where does this come from? Where does this failure to see differences in character come from? Well, my take on it is that there is a tendency in many people to want to see everybody as the same, what I call homogenizing people. You might say, in other words, that it's nice to be able to say or think that we're all one big happy family, and that everybody wants to help each other out, and that if someone isn't doing so, they're just having a bad day or woke up on the wrong side of bed that day, but that in general, everybody is a pretty good, decent human being. But this flies in the face of a couple things that some people either don't see or want to admit to themselves. That is, first of all, that not everybody is born into a family and extended family that provides them love, enough love that they don't come out highly traumatized and later very bitter and enraged and manipulative. And second of all, there isn't much discussion of how genetics plays a role in the level of empathy that someone has, both in childhood and for the rest of their lives. For instance, there's really very little discussion in psychology of how genetics plays a role in giving women more empathy built in than men on average, just by way of this being a necessity to properly raise children. And it could be a great liability for a man, especially way back in caveman days, where to be over-concerned or too empathetic about the animals or other cavemen you would have to fight or kill could mean death to you and your family. Another factor is whether your parents had a great deal of emotional baggage and as such were not treating you like a child would optimally be treated to come out as a healthy or well-functioning enough adult. There's a book written by a former psychoanalyst entitled "Thou Shalt Not Be Aware." And I forget the author's name, but for a while she was a psychoanalyst in Europe after giving it all up. And she maintained that sometimes one or more parents can put pressure on a child not to see, in general, how they're being treated, to include even severe treatment like rape or physical violence by being hit or beaten. And that then I would maintain a child put under too much of this pressure will essentially grow up to be very naive, not only about one or more of their parents or an extended relative in the family, but this transferring then in adulthood to all people, whereby one is not allowed in their own mind to be aware of who anyone is, thus being highly naive and then very vulnerable in life. And when vulnerable, suffering many instances of being manipulated, which then turns to rage afterward, and a vicious cycle ensuing. Another factor I've identified in growing up programmed to be naive is if one is in a family that never discusses other people at the dinner table or otherwise, such that the child never hears parents praising some people and putting down others as manipulative or even worse, evil if you wanted to use that word from a biblical perspective. So a child might grow up never hearing a parent criticize anyone or discuss traits of anyone at all that they know or who are in the news or in the public arena in general. And the child thus can easily grow up to believe that their parents think everybody is the same or homogeneous, and thus the child starts to believe early on that everybody is kind and loving and helpful and never manipulative, and then you never need to make distinctions between people and basically again end up very naive. Yet another factor is that it is generally taboo in certain societies to discuss openly the traits of people who are highly manipulative, including violent even, depending on the culture, such that the more violence in a particular culture, the more taboo it is to speak openly of the traits that go along with such a person, whereby you could easily identify someone like that and take precautions if only you knew what those traits were. But then what happens if a child is never taught to identify the traits, such that they're never essentially taught who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, and then it never being in print or on TV or even discussed in church really, to include what professions perhaps have a strong preponderance of manipulative or bad guys, so to speak, and which professions have a high preponderance of good guys. This all being very taboo to discuss in certain societies. And it can be carried further, of course, as to it being very taboo to discuss the traits of manipulative people when it comes to how they dress or what vehicles they may drive or what kind of housing they tend to purchase or where they might tend to live or what political party they may be in or even their religious affiliation. If your parents don't teach you these things, then where are you going to learn it except from the school of hard knocks? Furthermore, we all have a desire to see the best in people Because if we were on the lookout all the time for manipulation in people and society, particularly certain societies, then life could arguably be very dull, and perhaps even a little frightening, or more than frightening. Some people have said, in fact, that if I had to see all the ugliness in life, life wouldn't be worth living, and thus are unconsciously or even consciously putting blinders on themselves, because otherwise the world might look too ugly to them. And yet another issue comes from the Christian faith, whereby people are taught that everybody is a sinner and have fallen short of the glory of God. And while I would maintain that it is quite apparent that no person is perfect or even close to it, that on the other hand, there are great distinctions between people as to how imperfect they are in fact, and that if you want to use the term sinner to describe a human being, it might be wise to describe who is a big sinner and who is a small sinner, starting from how they were raised and what their genetic package is, and what environment they grew up in what era also, such that even in the Christian Bible, the man Job was cited as a most righteous man who later underwent many trials and tribulations while tested. And then there are the examples of Noah, or Joseph, or St. Paul. And arguably all of these people are sinners too, according to the standards in the Bible from the Genesis book. But later on, it being discussed that the Creator making great distinction between levels of inborn sin, or imperfection, if you will, whether it comes from whatever source. And to fail to make this distinction can be deadly, very serious. And Robert Greene talks of this very, very keenly in his books. A man who lost 50 jobs, by the way, before really coming out the other end in life. And his number one contention is that we human beings need to be much better judges of human character. And he says part and parcel of this is that we do a terrible job of observing. And it would, of course, be wonderful if we grew up in a family that taught us what to observe for and why it's even necessary. And to have the kind of parents who didn't mind their children observing them. And if a child didn't like what they saw, the parents being strong enough to allow the child to say what they saw and even rebel at times with anger, without repressing all this in the child. Yet another form of naivety in action I see comes from those who have been highly traumatized in childhood, especially from violence, to the extent where later, afterward, and extending all throughout adulthood, in fact, they want to deny that violence ever happened. And when they do this, it kind of transfers into how they view all people, such that they deny violence happens in all people. And again, arguably, what happens then is you have a person you could call naive. In fact, to the point where there ought to be a psychiatric diagnosis called naivete personality disorder, and that it rank amongst perhaps the most severe disorders out there, even worse than substance abuse, let's say, because if you cannot distinguish between someone who wants to help you versus those who do not, but are concealing it, then you're in big trouble. You're in worse trouble than if you are suffering from substance abuse, let's say. You will be subject to great violence. Hence the stories of how a woman may marry a man, find out he was violent, and get a divorce, and a year later marry another man just like him, and repeat this cycle over and over. You could say she's naive, and under the surface that she's denying that such types of people even exist because it's too frightening to roll back to her childhood and see the violence that she underwent. You could call it PTSD related. So to bury it, she buries the childhood violence issues, and this extends to all adult issues, including all possible future people she would marry over and over and over again. I have even seen this as very commonplace in some therapists, whereby they too are doing the same thing, denying violence they experienced in childhood, that, by the way, typically drove them to become therapists in the first place later on, trying to master this, but only halfway succeeding at best. And so, in trying to deny the childhood of many therapists that they experienced early on in life, they end up denying violence in society in general as adults. And when a patient or client may start to discuss violence they see in society, more often than not, the therapist may say things like, "You're paranoid," or "You're transferring how you were treated as a child onto society in general incorrectly," when in fact the client is trying to stop being so naive, trying to put two and two together in order to heal. With the disastrous result, though, that every time this starts to happen, the therapist can very easily start to quash it, saying the patient is paranoid, even to the point of administering medications or recommending them to treat paranoid schizophrenia. And if the patient persists in trying to uncover violence in their childhood and what they see it extending to when they look at certain people in their society, these persons can actually be forced into a mental institution under the claim that they're paranoid schizophrenics. Yet additional factors with clients seeing therapists or psychiatrists is the question of who is paying these professionals in the first place. So often, a person may come to therapy looking for help, asking for help, begging for help, and being willing in the first place to admit that they're not perfect and that they want to know more about how to grow and not just blame others for everything. They want to change their own outlook instead of trying to change others all the time. But who is paying these practitioners typically is not the suffering person, if they're a child, for instance. So, what allegiance will the therapist or psychiatrist have? Will it be toward the person who has been abused or oppressed? Or will it be more toward who is paying the person? For if the practitioner starts to tell the client that their parent or husband or wife is very abusive, payments, of course, are going to stop very quickly, aren't they? And then the person will soon be out of a job. So, what I tend to see happening all too often in severe abuse cases is that suffering people will get diagnosed with things like so-called bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, so-called, or so-called bipolar schizoaffective disorder, or ADHD, or even autism, or opposition defiance disorder. And the one thing that is rarely diagnosed, I mean very rarely, is PTSD. In other words, that the person is suffering from trauma. Unless, of course, the person has just come off of a battlefield, whereby it then is pretty obvious that there's quite a link there between their recent past and considerable suffering they may be having immediately afterward. But otherwise, if a practitioner were to render the diagnosis of PTSD in 80 to 95% of cases they see, then what? The next question, of course, would be, what is the source of the trauma? And if the source of the trauma is a person or organization that is paying the practitioner, then there's going to be quite a conflict of interest there, isn't there? And so, Dr. Colin Ross has written some books whereby he says in one that PTSD is rarely diagnosed, and that bipolar disorder is off the charts in terms of diagnosis frequency, which really makes you scratch your head, doesn't it? And so, between a client being told sometimes that they're paranoid or even a paranoid schizophrenic or some other quote-unquote very serious mental disorders, and then being administered drugs or having them recommended, or even being forced into institutions at times, and never being given the diagnosis of PTSD either, then what hope is there for the client to stop being naive in terms of trying to grapple with the very existence of their childhood, let alone the life they live in as an adult today, in a society here in America, for instance, that is arguably quite violent compared to some others. And last but not least, the vocabulary that we humans, especially in the West, have to use to describe people, especially traits pertaining to their personality, tend to be very much skewed toward blaming people and attributing their actions to choice rather than determinism, such that there are almost no words to describe people's traits, behaviorally or emotionally, or character-wise, that don't belittle them or demean them, or create feelings of hostility and blame, or what the Bible calls judgment, that we should not judge others. Well, how do you stop judging people if you don't have words that are not judgment-oriented, that don't carry buried within them the attitude that people could have done otherwise than they did, and so should be castigated and blamed and shamed and rejected. Now, all of this might not be that bad of a problem if a person is given to much aggression in general, much hostility. There are plenty of words they can use to describe traits in others that, while perpetuating their rage and anger and blame, at the same time do help them identify the good guys from the bad guys. And hence, a crook being able to use vocabulary to spot other crooks and stay away from being manipulated. But then what happens to the kind person who doesn't want to use hostile language because it riles up their emotions and is part and parcel of judging others when they shouldn't be? This can extend so far that much Eastern thought, from Buddhists, etc., say that we should not think at all. For what good is it, essentially, to think mean thoughts, to use words, terminology, if it engenders great consternation in one's emotional life? The Buddhists then urging us basically not to think at all and use intuition, because we don't have a set of vocabulary words that would not create rage in us every time we use them, to label particular traits and behaviors in other people around us, especially in a toxic environment. And another component in our vocabulary is that so many words are black and white, such that one term will describe a trait that has a minimal aspect to it, and another word will describe the same trait at the extreme opposite end of the continuum, but that there are almost no words to describe what's in between on this continuum. Hence you could call it black and white thinking. And then again, if you're doing this, you're going to tend to start to see everybody as the same. And if you do this, you could arguably be called naive and suffer grave consequences all throughout your life. Again, then, contributing to why the Buddhists and others in the East very much say all the time, don't think, or you think too much. Because if the prime tool in thinking is our vocabulary to process what we see and think and remember symbolically, then the only other alternative is to not think at all and use strictly intuition. So these are the factors I see at play when we see that we may be naive. Some people would be classified as such, perhaps. And the factors that keep people this way, sometimes for life, and very painfully so. And I would posit that the way out of this, hopefully, would be to educate oneself from people who discuss character, like Robert Greene and Wayne Dyer, in the hope that this would stimulate us to refine our vocabulary, to describe traits that we should be not only noticing but labeling, not to condemn, but simply to process in our mind as data more than anything that would help us ironically develop much more compassion toward those we earlier used to feel rage toward. I hope this is of some help. It's been a long process getting to this point in my life. And it's a shame that there's not more talk of this. But sadly, that is simply the way it is, I'm afraid. I wish you well.